Hey guys, welcome back for another episode of The Suited Shootist. And what I want to talk about today is your training and your practice may be giving you the wrong idea about what's important. And this is kind of stemming from some observations and some conversations that I've had with some friends of mine, both just kind of in the shooting space at large, as well as a couple of my instructor friends. And I figured that this was kind of worth mentioning. Particularly, the two things that I think are worth addressing the most are weapon lights and reloads. I'm using an airsoft pistol just because, honestly, for the purposes of this, there's no real need for a live firearm. So it's an added layer of safety, and quite frankly, I didn't want to take ammunition out of a pistol just to film the video. So that's why we're here. Reloads and weapon lights, especially when you're talking to people who are coming into concealed carry specifically in the early stages. As many of us do, they default to the internet to try and figure out what best practices are. And once they try and figure out what best practices are, fingers crossed, they go out, they get a little bit of training, and if it sticks, they are then going to be inclined to take even more. And it's a good thing with a big ol' asterisk, because if it's not properly tempered, it can give folks the wrong impression. So let's touch on weapon lights first. I don't carry with a weapon light in the instance that I'm going to use a handgun as a home defense option. That's really the main reason why I have this TLR1, is, if I'm going to be doing the whole nightstand gun thing. But honestly, for the most part, my home defense gun is a pump action 12 gauge. But that's its own thing. You hear a lot of folks talk about, there are some very niche benefits to it, but a lot of what you see in terms of the folks that are sort of advocating for it, whether it's themselves or the information that they're drawing from, it is very heavily influenced by duty gear. And Will Petty actually put up a comment. I don't remember the exact number, but a strong majority of officer-involved shootings took place in low light and around a vehicle. And so because of that, the weapon-mounted pistol light is very commonly best practice amongst those who carry a gun for a living. But you also got to remember, there are circumstances for them where there's a greater probability that they will be producing a firearm, bring it out of a holster before they're bringing it to bear, that may not necessarily be applicable, appropriate for us in the private sector. That's a big one. The other part of it is that for as limited as law enforcement or government training may be, it still exists to some degree. And even if it's not a training thing, there is policy in place dictating the use for things like this. And so the challenge is that if John Q. Citizen or Jane Q. Citizen with an open checkbook and an open mind is trying to figure out how to set themselves best up for success with a defensive carry gun, the internet is going to suggest that something like this is recommended, if not high priority. But it completely glosses over the fact that somebody can go out and, for a fairly reasonable cost, get a decent quality light and slap it on the end of their gun. But here's the thing. Just like we wouldn't advocate for somebody to just go buy a gun and stick it in a holster, because at that point they're kind of a liability when it comes to effective use. Why don't we have that same attitude about weapon lights? Because the reality of it is that while the light in and of itself, just as a standalone unit, does not possess nearly the degree of risk that a firearm does, but guess what? As soon as you put it on a pistol, it's not just a flashlight anymore. It's a gun with a light attached to it. And so if the internet sort of cognoscenti, or if just the general discussion is going to advocate for a weapon light being best practice, which I'm not convinced it is, then it's incumbent on the people making that recommendation to acknowledge the potential liabilities that go with it, as well as be a little bit more specific as to the need for training. Because if you say, oh, well, yeah, obviously you need to go get low light training, okay, that's kind of like saying, well, obviously you need to go take a pistol class. We all know they ain't all created the same. So, from that standpoint, it's very easy to get caught up and get the impression that this is more essential than it actually is, and it can consume a lot more time and effort and money that may be worth focused elsewhere. I mean, I'm a little over 500 hours of open enrollment training right now. Just at that 500-hour cusp. I haven't taken a low-light class yet. It's on my list, but it's not super high on the list. So I'll get to it when I get to it. But the other part of how training can give you a false impression of priority, just like how this whole internet discussion, I think, over prioritizes the weapon light, it's the same thing when it comes to reloads. Because the reality is even in a one-day class, even if it's a relatively conservative round count, let's say 250, 300 rounds. Let's say 300 rounds because it makes the math easy. 300 rounds in a 15-round gun. If my math is right, that is, 20 reloads? Just in the course of a one-day class with 250 rounds. Most of the classes that we take are upwards of 1,000. So that's a lot of reps of topping off the gun. And hopefully, most of us have a whole lot more time logged in training, shooting in a controlled environment, than we do getting into gunfights. But because of that, the reload of the pistol, as well as the corresponding immediate action, is a lot more relevant on the square range than the data seems to bear out when it comes to actual private sector defensive shootings. So, again, I see a lot of people that, especially early on, they're struggling to find a way to realistically accommodate another magazine along with the other support gear. And I see some people that are sacrificing better concealment for the sake of carrying spare ammunition. And whether it is, talking about topping the gun off after the fight, or whether it is about addressing malfunctions or anything else, my attitude has always been this: if you're able to accommodate it without any major concessions or thought or headache, cool, rock on, go for it. But if it starts becoming a challenge or an inconvenience, you gotta ask yourself, is it really worth the time and the effort to try and now adjust your lifestyle to accommodate something that is, at the bare minimum, it is straying into the far, far end of the bell curve. And once you start getting to the concept of thinking that you need an extra mag, well, then obviously your focus is going to be on getting those reloads as efficient and as quick as you possibly can, which, again, cool. I can tell you that in the Rangemaster Instructor Development class, there was not a single timed reload. In the last several performance shooting classes that I've taken, none of the the reload time has never really been a delineating factor. I mean, if you got a screaming fast reload, yeah, it's gonna make the casino drill a little bit easier. It's gonna make the fast a little bit easier, stuff like that. But again, is that time and effort better spent elsewhere? Because even if it's just the dry work repetitions of it, that's still time and mental energy that's dictated towards that activity versus wargaming more ambiguous shooting circumstances versus seeking out training and finding ways to practice actually putting the brakes on and stopping a shot somewhere in the process, or aborting a string of fire instead of predetermining, okay, I'm going to shoot 5 rounds and plugging all 5 of them, instead of maybe after that third shot you've got some indication that no more shots are needed. And so that's really it, is that while a light, extra ammunition, all this is optimal, sometimes optimal and practical are not necessarily the same thing. And especially for the folks for whom training is more of a necessity than it is a pastime, those folks especially really need to make sure that every hour of training that they take is as efficient and they're getting the highest ROI possible that they can out of it. And honestly, even at this point for me, I'm not supremely focused on, like, how much reload practice I did gearing up for Rangemaster? Very little. I shot the casino drill a couple of times, and that was really just to kind of figure out where I wanted my mag pouches placed. But I wasn't like timing my one reload ones or anything like that. If you are trying to compete at a very high level, then I think there is going to be a lot more merit to something like that. But if your focus is defensive pistol craft, then given how broad that topic actually is and how narrow of a sliver the entire gun handling piece actually makes up, you got to ask if the juice is worth the squeeze. Because again, you've got medical, you've got legal, you've got combatives, you've got your overall physical fitness, you've got the social fluency, verbal agility, and critical thinking skills. So there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle, because the consequences for getting it wrong are life-altering. So again, it's a matter of taking a step back and looking critically at why we're doing the things that we're doing. Because the truth of the matter is that thought process, it applies to style the same way that it applies to shooting. There are people that think that the concepts of understanding, say, color palettes and pattern matching are exclusive to things like suits, where you've got a suit, a shirt, a tie, maybe a pocket square, and you've got to make sure that all that jives. Reality is, even if you're just wearing a shirt and a pair of pants, there's still color palettes that you want to work in. There are certain patterns that work together, certain ones that don't, etc. And the reality of it is that principles tend to apply a whole lot more universally. And so it's a matter of just making sure. People are going to accuse me of overthinking. Other people are going to say that, you just don't want to put the work in to shoot at that level. Those folks are actually right, because shooting at that level is not a really high priority for me. But it's again the whole thing. If I took the time that I spent at jiu-jitsu and focused all that effort into shooting, I'd probably be a better shooter. If I took the medical classes that I took, or the legal classes that I took, and put those hours into shooting, I'd probably be an A-class shooter. But again, that's not my goal. You've got to figure out what your goal is and then tailor the thought process to it. But do not sort of get taken off track because you're taking someone who is coming from a duty gear standpoint and then trying to shoehorn that into, a white collar lifestyle because they're not particularly compatible. Not saying that it can't be done, but it's going to be harder than it needs to. So, what do you guys think? I want to hear some feedback on this. What are some red herrings that you got caught up in that you realized, man, I am making this a lot harder on myself than I had to? Put it down in the comments. Other than that, I hope everybody has a fantastic week. Stay dangerous and stay sharp.